Welcome to the very first live episode of Shadow School. I am your host, Brianna Lease Miller. For the next 64 days, barring any unforeseen circumstances, I will be coming to you live each and every day where we will examine, talk about, and dive into one of the shadows in each of the 64 gene keys. If you see me looking up or down, that's because I've got multiple lives going here. I'm live on Instagram up here. Hello, Instagram family. I'm live on LinkedIn down here and also YouTube. And so you can access Shadow School in any one of these three locations. Replays obviously get popped into YouTube. I'll be posting replays on Instagram every day. And I will be also collecting all these replays in one place on my website. Just today, I created a page for Shadow School on my website, which is briannalease.com, where you'll be able to access all the replays and see the schedule. So one of the questions I got when I posted yesterday that I was doing this Shadow School is what time are you going live so that I can attend these? And my answer was, well, it kind of depends on the day. But I did some thinking, and after that, I looked to find as much of a consistent time as possible. And for me, that's this 10 a.m. slot from a Central Time perspective. So for the most part, for the next 64 days, so this is now through April 5th, I will attempt and do my best to go live at 10 a.m. Central for Shadow School. There are a few exceptions, and I do have that schedule listed on my website. I'll also do my best to promote and let you all know ahead of time when actually I'll be going live on that day. So let's hop in. What the heck is Shadow School? Why are we talking about shadows? Today is going to be a little bit longer of a session because I'm also going to introduce the topic of a shadow, talk to you about the gene keys a little bit, and then we'll dive into today's shadow, which is entropy. So first things first, what the heck is the gene keys? The gene keys is a modern synthesis of an ancient wisdom system called the I Ching, which was originally used, still is used for divination. But really what is contained in the I Ching is a set of 64 different gates, you could look at it, archetypes, consciousness levels, collective, unified human archetypes of consciousness. And there are many ways that we can work with this system of information. One of the ways is just in pure contemplation, like we're doing with Shadow School. We're going to take one piece of one of the 64 gene keys, and we're going to discuss it and contemplate it and look at it and see how and where it plays out in our lives or in the lives of the people around us that we can look at. There's another way that you can work with it, which is to actually go to genekeys.com and you can enter in your birth date, time, location. And what it will do is it will take your astrological information and the 64 gates of the I Ching, and it will create for you a Gene Keys hologenetic profile. This is a snapshot of your unique path and the unique gene keys that show up in your chart, your profile, they have some resonance for you in your specific life. So if you're interested in learning more about that and how to work with the gene keys in that way, you can go to genekeys.com. It's really quick and simple. You can get a free profile and you can start playing around there. I think that might be fun if you are interested in watching Shadow School. I'm going to be going through the gene keys 1 through 64 in order with you over the next 64 days. But you might like to go to genekeys.com and get your free hologenetic profile so that you can see which keys are in your profile. So let's say gene key 6, for example, for me is in my purpose sphere in my profile. And when we get to gene key 6, it just adds another layer of me looking at this like, okay, there's some reason why this is present in my life. Let's explore this gene key further. So that's another option for you. If you have any questions about this or don't know where to start, just send me a message on Instagram or LinkedIn. And I'm happy to have a conversation with you about the gene keys in more depth and any questions that you have related to that. The Gene Keys was this book written, the synthesis, in a very poetic manner by a man named Richard Rudd. And he is really kind of the prominent face of the Gene Keys and the system and all of the content and courses that have been created as a result. Gene Keys has a specific approach to working with the synthesis, and it diverges from the approach that many of us are really comfortable with and used to in this very force dominance focused world that we all live in. And that approach is fueled by contemplation, which is a gentle path to playing with information through the mind, through the emotions, through the physical body, of which I have a podcast episode in full detail around contemplation you can access on my Substack, briannalise.substack.com. And also I have a series right here on Instagram that goes through a 5-part series about what is contemplation, how do you contemplate, what do you contemplate, etc., and share some of my own personal examples. The other thing I will say is Gene Keys' approach is really focused on gentleness. So I've got a dog situation here. Give me a second. Frisco, go lay down, buddy. Come on. Go to bed. Managing the household over here. It's really a path that is fueled by gentleness, patience, and inquiry. So contemplation definitely, as a set of skills, relies on those 3 aspects. But so much of how we are taught to absorb information, to learn things, to work with concepts, to achieve goals, to strive, is so very outcome-based, so very externally projected. It's forced, it's linear. We do this step, then that step, then this step to get that outcome. Working with the Gene Keys, working with these shadows, requires that we actually take a step back from that pushing and driving forward. And we actually take on a very different orientation to this work. We see it as a practice. We develop the skills of inquiry and self-inquiry and curiosity and not having to answer even all of the questions that arise to us in the moment. It's not about answering. It's not about knowing necessarily. It's more about being in the practice of inquiring. It's understanding that as we go through this, we need to have some deep patience, not feel like we need to have certainty or knowing all of the answers, not feeling like we have to see change immediately in order for change to actually be taking place. So that's the approach that we're going to work with in Shadow School. We're going to use contemplation skills. I'm sure I'll weave these in and out as we go every day. I don't want to overwhelm you at the beginning. So without further ado, we're going to dive into what is a shadow, and then what is the shadow we're working with today. A shadow is very simply it's an energetic frequency that impacts our consciousness and how we see ourselves and the world. And it's typically shaped and created by some sort of event. And when I say event, I don't necessarily mean some big traumatic event. It could be a thought you had, or a perception that you had, meaning that you made over a reaction of someone else. And typically these come to life for us in our early developing years, from 1 to 7. We create a lot of these shadows. And what that means is we learn based on our interactions with the outside world that perhaps certain parts of ourselves, certain ways that we show up, and certain aspects of our identity are perhaps not acceptable. They're not desirable. They don't feel like we can receive love if we share them with the world. They're a little risky and they make us feel vulnerable to share. And as a result, what happens over time of us wanting to belong and being afraid that if we share these parts of ourselves that we will not belong and be accepted by the group, is that we start to hide them. We start to suppress these sides of ourselves. We ignore them. We forget that they're there over time a lot as we grow into adulthood, and we don't even remember that these little bits of ourselves, these parts of our inner child, these shadows are there. So these are all the parts that we feel like are not acceptable to show the world for any reason. We feel perhaps shame about these parts of ourselves. We want to hide them. We don't feel like we can share them widely. This is where our shadows live. This is where we have attached to some fear that we will not be loved or accepted, that we're unsafe, whatever that may be. And that fear then creates this kind of protection where we don't show this part of ourselves. And what we get into is understanding that humans think that the mind is what's controlling everything. And in our society, it does a lot. I won't dive into why I disagree with this, but what I will say is that what we think is the conscious mind only makes up like 10% or even less of the actual process of the mind itself. 90% or more is actually subconscious, things that we're not aware of. And that's where our shadows live. So we might not be aware that we actually even have these shadow patterns, let alone that we're actually acting from them in our day-to-day lives. And many of the reactions, the things we say, the things we think, and the way that we see the world and ourselves are driven and rooted in these unconscious, these subconscious shadow fear patterns. So the work to be done and why we are here at Shadow School is to actually take a look. We're gonna open up the doors and we're gonna look into the darkness. You can call it the darkness. I don't see it as darkness. You know, we can look at those parts of ourselves that we've been ignoring, that we haven't been allowing to express in the world. And we can look at our beliefs and how we see the world and our assumptions about ourselves and others. And in doing so, we can raise them into awareness. And when we are in awareness with these things, as opposed to being unaware of them, we actually have the opportunity to work with them. We have the opportunity to be in a state of inquiry where we can say things like, is this way of seeing myself or operating in the world, this behavior, this pattern I've got, is this actually serving me? This pattern that was created when I was 6 based on something that doesn't even make any sense and I can't even understand where it came from now as an adult. Does this behavior that I have still make sense for me as an adult now for the things that I want now in my life? And so we get to kind of look at what got us here and will it get us to where we want to be? So this is an opportunity to bring some things that are in our subconscious to the level of conscious awareness so that we can work with them, so that we can love them into wholeness, so that we can bring them into the light, so that we can recognize the actual gifts that are within them. Because oftentimes we kind of cleave off these parts of ourselves thinking that they're bad or undesirable, when in fact, they're actually just beautiful gifts inside of them that are a huge part of our uniqueness that we've been just totally ignoring and not sharing to the world. So that's why we're doing this work, a little bit more about shadows. So now let's talk about the shadow for today. Today, we're starting with gene key 1, the first gene key, which is the shadow of entropy. The dog. Go lay down, buddy. Come on. Go on. Go to bed. Poor Bubba. There are only so many sunshine spots in the house right now. And Briscoe and Teddy are trying to both fight for the same sunshine spot and also be in proximity to Shadow School, which is happening right now. So that's the dynamic that's playing out at the house. I appreciate your patience with the doggos. If you're really interested in diving more into this, I will recommend that you go onto Amazon and you buy a copy of the Gene Keys book. It contains a lot more depth than we're going to go into in each of the 3 levels or frequency states of consciousness within each gene key. There are actually 3 states. There's the shadow, the gift that emerges from the shadow, and then the Siddic level. It's SIDDH HI, and it means divine gift. So I'm going to put these away for now, and we're going to dive into the shadow of entropy. Entropy is, in basic definition, the fact that there is only so much energy within a closed system. So if we consider ourselves, like our individual human bodies, as a closed system, there's only so much energy to go around. If we look at our world and our collective society as somewhat of a closed system, we could look at it that way. We could notice there's only so much energy. There's only so much creativity. There's, we look at things in such a finite way as humans. So this concept of entropy really means there's only so much energy to go around here. Now, when we're working with the first gene key, the very first gene key is all about creation and creativity. It's all the energy and the fire around the masculine creativity and creating. And so when we look at entropy and creativity, there is a natural dance that occurs here. There's a natural cycle at play. Creation, and then entropy, this lack of energy. So if we look at creativity as an expression of energy, what naturally results after that is a cycle of rest, or a period where we're not creating things. Now, you could be listening to this and going like, of course, duh, that totally makes sense. However, we live in a society, as I'm sure we're all aware, and we have jobs and we have pressures where we're expected, or we have the expectation on ourselves, to be constantly on. We're constantly producing. We need to be efficient. We need to be always producing things, creating things. And so we have to be creative at any moment, every moment of the day. Well, I'm sorry, but we are also a part of nature. We're not apart from it. Humans are a part of nature. And what that means is we have natural cycles of birth and death, of creation, and then needing to rest. If we just look at the seasons, right now here in Illinois, I'm in winter, which is a season of rest. We're actually in the season of entropy, if you want to look at it that way. Whereas spring and summer are all about creation and birth and bringing new things to life and growth. Fall is kind of that winding down and that nestling in the harvest of all of our creations. And then we get into winter, which is really like an example of entropy in nature. Humans need this also in our work. We need to have a balance of being on and creating and making things and working and making things happen, and also resting, digesting, like allowing new things to percolate, allowing new ideas to come in. If we're constantly going and creating, that there's no room for any of that to exist. So here's what happens. We try to force. Because it doesn't appear to us from where we're sitting in this fear consciousness of entropy that there is a possibility where we can have rest periods, and yet there's not enough energy. And so what we do is we kind of drive ourselves into the ground. And this is really honestly where a state of burnout emerges from, the state of entropy. So one of the things that happens, and I've got just some notes here that I'll be looking down at in case you're wondering, why is she looking down? When we look at the shadow of entropy, what often happens is humans are, unless you have a high level of awareness, and unless you understand your own personal cycles and rhythms of creation and general life, and the greater collective cycles and rhythms of life and nature and creation, oftentimes we can identify with or overly attach to certain states or certain parts in a cycle. And then we kind of like make the suffering more acute there. We make the pain more acute there. Anytime we attach to things, that's what happens. Anytime we're not just in the natural flow and rhythm of life, and we are attaching, or we're trying to force something or fix something or have things be a certain way that we want them to be, we're pulling ourselves out of that natural rhythm. And as a result, we're kind of like attached. We're attached to outcomes. We're attached to it being a certain way. And honestly, all that tends to create is pain and suffering. That's pain and suffering. Okay. So when we get into entropy, what tends to happen when people are in a state of natural rest, void, recharge, entropy, is that we get a little nervous about it and we get a little freaked out and we take it on almost like it's an emotion in the body. We experience it as an emotion. And this feeling is one of numbness and gloom, and it can lead into a depressive state. And so another way to look at this is it's almost like a freeze state from a nervous system perspective, where you actually do lose your ability to have higher level cognitive functioning if you attach and sink into it. You actually start to lose your ability to have thought and creativity and ideas and to see possibility. So in attaching to the natural cycle of entropy and feeling it like an emotion in our bodies of numbness and gloom, we can easily kind of get sucked in. We sink ourselves deeper into this kind of freeze depressive state, which is really fascinating, which gets us less of what we actually wanted, by the way. I just want to point that out. So that's kind of what happens in shadow is we think we want something, we want an outcome, and often then the way that we act or the way that we react in a certain scenario that's driven by the shadow we're unaware of actually works against us. It does not get us what we want. It totally works in opposite effect to what we actually want. What's actually happening here is that the body has just done, and the being has just created something or gone through a period of intense work or production or energy output. And we naturally need, and this could be short or it could be long. It really depends on the cycle. It really depends on what the energy expenditure was and what's coming next. And there are so many factors that go into like what this entropy state feels like and how long it is and how you deal with it also makes a difference. But what this actually creates in us is a void space. And the void space, if we could just sit here for a moment with this numbness, this entropy, this kind of like frozen, almost like a paralyzed feeling. You're in a stasis. Think about being like in a chrysalis or in a nest or in a womb. You are in this fertile void state. And I call it a fertile void state because this is the state into which new things spring forward. Okay, so if we are not cultivating and creating inner spaciousness to hold and be inside of this discomfort or be comfortable with this void state, then we're not creating any room. We are not clearing any space for fertile new ideas and new creations to find us, to be created, to be found within us. And so what that ends up doing is it kind of like doubles down on itself in a couple of ways. So one of the ways, and I will get clearer on this as we go. This will start to make a little bit more sense. But for each shadow state in the gene keys, there is a repressive state, like an expression that is repressive. And this is usually a more introverted expression of the shadow, which means it's more internally focused and it's more of like a collapsing inward due to the fear. And then there's a reactive expression of the shadow, which is where it's more anger based actually, and it's more outwardly expressed into the world and projected usually into the world in some way. And when we're looking at the shadow of entropy, we have the repressive state. That's the introverted, collapsed internal version of depressive. And what this means is that we actually really do get and find ourselves in this fear state in our nervous system that we're frozen. And the more we sit there and the more we're uncomfortable with it and the more we dwell on it and the more we try to intellectually understand and explain what's happening there to ourselves, the more we start to kind of like coil into this depressive state. And in fact, it can end up having us be in a state of depression. Because what happens here is we start to kind of pull away from the surface of our life. There's a way to recognize when you're in a void state and you're in just a period of recharging and resting. You're in this fertile womb space while still interacting with your life. And just knowing like, it's okay that I'm not producing something right now. It's okay that I'm not super productive right now. I'm in a void state. I've just produced all these things over here. Now I need a minute. I need a hot minute to like rest and recharge so that I can go do the most amazing thing next that's going to come. If we don't allow that to happen and we sink into this depressive state, then it can actually turn into depression. Hi to the few of you that are joining on Instagram. We also have a reactive state that gets to be expressed. So again, this is more of like the anger, outwardly focused, projected expression of this fear state, and that is frenetic. So here we see a lot of control at play. This is where we're like, okay, I'm in this void state. This is so uncomfortable to me. I don't want to be here. This is not helpful to the work and the things I have to get done today. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to fix this. I'm going to fix this right up. I'm going to force my way out of it. I don't want to be here. This is getting in my way. I don't like it. And so we start to do more. We start to interact with more people. We take on more projects. We basically fill up every single second of every single moment. So we don't have to be in that state, that uncomfortable void state. And as a result, we're kind of like doing escapism, distraction, avoidance of actually sitting in the discomfort of the void. And we're trying to fix it. We're trying to get out of it by doing everything that we can. Well, this is very obvious, like leading to burnout. This is when it really becomes present in your body that you are like not only mentally exhausted, spiritually exhausted, you are now starting to be physically exhausted. And this is when our adrenals start to take a bump. And, like it's all kind of a downward spiral from here. And both these depressive states and the burnout states are something that only we can pull ourselves out of. And in both cases, it requires that we actually take responsibility and not see ourselves as the victim in these situations. That void state is something that's happening to me. Why can't I be creative all the time? Or why is this depression happening to me again? Or why does everybody ask me to do everything at work? Meanwhile, I'm piling on all of these things so that I don't have to feel uncomfortable or like I'm not producing as much as I was last week, because my worth is tied to how much I can work and produce. So you can see how we can identify almost like in a victim state in each of these shadows as we move forward in shadow school. And so I'm going to wrap up with this today. We've been going for about 30 minutes. I anticipate these will be much shorter on the days where I don't have to give you the whole lead up. So now you understand shadow school, what we're trying to achieve, a little bit about the gene keys, all of that. And we have explored the shadow of entropy. Now, this is a shadow that I some more than others, I have examples and I can personally identify with. This is definitely one I can identify with. And what I will say is when we get ourselves into when we find ourselves in this fertile void state, this kind of numb, frozen state, it can be really easy to allow the mind to run away and start telling us all of the fear-based things that are actually the most unhelpful in this situation. You're not producing enough. Well, other people think that you're not working. Are you going to be able to ever create something good again? What? You could just keep going on and on and on here in this kind of more numb, depressive state. And then on the other end, being in the frenetic state, like I can identify with both the repressive and the reactive expressions here. I've experienced both of these, and sometimes, honestly, both of them simultaneously, I have to say. And with this reactive, frenetic state of kind of pushing yourself to fix and force on the path to burnout, that again is an area where we've got to accept responsibility and to see where our patterns from early childhood and earlier in our lives of shaping our beliefs so that we have to constantly prove, constantly be creating in order to have value and worth as human beings, those are at play there. Those are at play. And we've got to take responsibility for those, allow, accept, and embrace them into our lives, love them up, and take a good, solid look at them. Where do they come from? What are they serving us? Because they're doing a job for us right now. They're protecting us in some way. They're keeping us safe in some way. They're helping us achieve some level of external success in some way. How can we thank them? How can we recognize them for their work and say, thank you so much. I'm grateful for you. I've got it from here. And then from a conscious space, how can we look at this experience of being in the fertile void, in these moments between creativity, between production, between work and efficiency? How can we look at these fertile void spaces as these nourishing, womb-like environments that allow us to resource ourselves and recharge? What could we do in those moments to recognize we're there with love in the moment and resource ourselves and give ourselves what we need without judgment? Oh, I'm feeling like I'm in a void state here. Okay, this is a great time for me to go take baths. This is a great time for me to get back into nature and recharge myself. And that doesn't mean I'm not working. I might still be thinking about work from time to time, but I'm allowing my mind and my being to rest and recharge in the way that it needs to, such that I can be creative again. Some things for you to think about. Some things for you to contemplate. I am very curious to hear if you've watched this episode of Shadow School in exploring the shadow of entropy and these states of depressive and frenetic expressions of the shadow states. What is coming up for you? How have you experienced this? How has this played out in your life or in your work? What is alive for you as you've been listening to me share about this particular shadow? And what are you going to contemplate around this area? What is one thing that you're taking away from this session that will help you begin to kind of open the window, just crack the window on this shadow and start to look at some of your own patterns around work and pressure and burnout, creativity, depressive states, feeling stuck and paralyzed, being uncomfortable in this void? I really, really, really want to have a conversation with you around this. So I'd love if you would share your comments. If you don't feel comfortable sharing your comments publicly, please send me a direct message. I'm here. I want to have these conversations with you. Until tomorrow, let me tell you what we'll be talking about tomorrow. Give me 1 second. Here we go. Ready? This is a little key here at the end. Tomorrow, we are going to be talking about the shadow of dislocation. Okay? So, until then, I will see you in another episode of Shadow School. Thank you so much for joining me. Ending broadcasts.